Seb's Soapbox. Hello and welcome to another edition of Seb's Soapbox, the YouTube program that makes you say, "What, this guy again?" Uh, yeah. Um, so today, I want to talk about the old question whether or not the United States is a republic or a democracy, or what that means, what this question entails, where it comes from, um, who's right, who's wrong, yeah, what is the argument here? Um, because like there is this argument on the right for the most part that the United States is actually not a democracy, that the United States is a republic, and that is one of the reasons that American politics works in the way that it does. Uh, because it is a republic, it is not a democracy. That means that American politics does not bend to the will of the obeying masses. Um, and well, that is to a certain degree true, because the American political system has indeed a whole slew of fail-safes that make sure that minoritarian rule, so the rule of an opinion or of the people who are actually the smaller part of the population, will always have a larger say than the majority, the larger part of the population, who should eat the smaller part. But, well, at least if the smaller part is rich people or cops. I don't know. So the system has this whole slew of fail safes. And the arguably most important and most powerful of these implements that work towards this are spread over all three branches of government. So there's the Supreme Court and the judiciary, the Senate and the legislative, and the electoral college in the executive branch of government. So let's start looking at the Supreme Court. What makes the Supreme Court such an anti-democratic institution? So first of all, nowhere in the world do courts wield as much power as the American Supreme Court does, which is something that celebrated historian Gordon as Wood of Good Will Hunting fame writes in his work on the early Republic, Empire of Liberty. The Supreme Court supposedly is one of the three co-equal branches of American government, but today that has kind of changed because the court has been basically captured by right-wing Christofascists. It's just what they are. And between the executive, the president, and the legislative, Congress, and the judicative, the Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, is now more than just a check on the other branches of government. And it's basically going to wreak havoc on American politics, likely for as long as anyone listening or watching this, watching to this. I know, stop it. You know English. Anyway, but where does this whole concept even come from? Why is the Supreme Court the way that it is? So first of all, the Supreme Court is designed to be not elected but appointed. So that's a quality that the court shares with the Senate, as it was initially designed until the early 1900s, and I'll get back to that later. The wise, infallible, slaveholding founding fathers designed the court in this way. And those benign, long-dead dudes who, over most other things, feared the mob. No, not as in Don Corleone, but as in the masses. The Constitution may wax poetically about the people and that all men are created equal and all those high-minded things, but that's ultimately just a facade. Under the surface, the founding documents and ideas that this here nation are built upon are, in fact, actually shockingly undemocratic. In the sense that the only people initially having the right to vote in elections were supposed to be white, landed, and male. What does that mean? White because, well, it's like, who else? It's not like he would let black slaves vote. Landed because, as they had it back then, the vote should only go to those who have a measurable stake in the country. As in people who own land. That's what stake in the country means in this case. And male because, well, women could not own land, so yeah, whoops. And now the Supreme Court is not elected at all, and worse, unlike either chamber of Congress or the presidency, Supreme Court justices, like most federal judges, are lifetime appointments, and this too is rooted in just how much the founding fathers mistrusted democratic outcomes. But the real issue with the Supreme Court is actually something that was not necessarily in the founding documents, and it's not something that is in the Constitution or something that even necessarily the founding fathers, if you want to give them any kind of bigger credence, intended or came up with. This is the principle of judicial review. That in the way it's practiced today means that these unelected lifetime appointments have the ultimate say on what is and what is not constitutional federal law. And as one of our guests on This Is Hell this week, legal scholar William Forbath put it, the Constitution of the United States was never meant to be up for legal interpretation. It was supposed to be the foundation of the system of government that the people could hold over those making up government at any given time. Granted, people in this context means rich, upper, and maybe, if we're being generous, wealthy members of the middling classes, and not the masses, not the poor, not the lower classes, not the workers or anything. Always question who we and the people are supposed to even represent in these documents. That's kind of important. Again, that's because it's a facade, but I digress. The courts, the Supreme Court included, were never, at least not originally, intended to put their own interpretation to the Constitution. It was not supposed to be handled like any other law, but judicial review changed that. The interesting part is that this power was, in theory, established in 1802 in the Marbury v. Madison case. Look it up. I don't have time to go into that. But the Chief Justice at the time, and historians agree on that, apparently not even intended for his decision to have this effect. As historian Sean Valence, who I don't like, who is kind of a really problematic person, so apologies for citing that guy, but he has written a bunch of dry but ultimately important books that I have and that I work with. So as Sean Valence put it, Chief Justice Marshall, the guy at the time who sort of invented judicial review, never used the power of the court to probe the constitutionality of federal legislation in his remaining life term after he sort of established it first. And even after his death, the court would not practice judicial review until the Dred Scott decision, which really should give anyone all the pause in the world, because today we have a Supreme Court that, in competition for awfulness with the court of Roger Taney, the Chief Justice who oversaw the Dred Scott case, and especially because of the nonsensical notion of originalism by a bunch of robed assholes who demonstrate no better understanding of history than most undergraduate freshmen. And this requires some elaboration because I'm just starting to ramble here. What does this all mean? So today we have a court of people who call themselves originalists who probe federal legislation if it's in accordance with what the court members today think, and again, this is kind of a throwback to the presentism episode, that the people who wrote the Constitution and made the founding principles of the nation wanted. And if that wasn't a problem, like if the issue at hand was not a problem in the 18th and early 19th century, then these are not things that government can regulate today. Apparently, because, yeah, who knows? That becomes a problem with when the underlying principle itself, the principle that the court can indeed decide these things in the first place, was demonstrated by a guy who invented it but did not intend to work it that way. So it's all like it's really nuts, right? It's kind of crazy. And making matters worse, if you look at the Dred Scott decision, which sort of like established, like after it was established in Marbury v. Madison, that was in 1802, in the Dred Scott decision, if for those of you who paid attention in history class, was in the 1850s. So over 50 years later, it took over 50 years for a super racist asshole Supreme Court justice, head of the Supreme Court, to pick this up again and be like, hey, yeah, let's actually strike this here down. That's quite something, because, you know, the federal legislation part says that Congress had no power. So well, what Roger Taney said, essentially, was that Congress had no power to limit slavery, because if Congress limited slavery, that would bestow rights of citizenship upon black people, and black people, by his definition, could not be citizens. Good night, end of story. And that's the legacy of the court. And that's where judicial review was first practiced as a limit of federal legislation, because it was supposedly not in line with the Constitution. And that's where we can find the principle of judicial review emerging as such the first time. But ultimately, what does judicial review mean in terms of democracy? It means that a group of unelected officials have the absolute power to decide whether or not the elected officials of the government decided in arbitrary ways that the people on the court at the time agree with. Or if they disagree with it, then they just decide that arbitrarily that the people who actually were elected to enact certain things did not act in accordance with the Constitution, and therefore, can't do anything about that. The justice can simply make an argument that, in their opinion, a law is or isn't constitutional, and that's that. Because the Supreme Court cannot be, it's the Supreme Court. It's the highest instance. It cannot be questioned. It cannot be, once the Supreme Court has said anything, there is nothing that can be done. Now let's look at other parts of government. So the founders wanted a government that was working best for people exactly like them, not for everybody, even though they seem to have proclaimed that. They threw the middling folks, so what you would call the middle classes today, a bone with the House of Representatives. And then they made sure that this body would not get too much say in things. Also, the notion of everybody, right? The notion of the people was different back then. The founders were different from British nobles insofar as that they lacked inheritable titles and lineages. But they sure were all rich. They all owned land. Most of them owned slaves, and so on and so forth. Some historians make the claim that the founders were, at the time, the richest men in America. And that's who they wanted inalienable rights for. The masses, they were terrified of the masses. The Senate was put up there to be a permanent check on democracy. And that's not something I'm making up. That's in the sources. They said so themselves. If the masses, through vote or other persuasions, managed to flip things in the House of popular representatives one way, the Senate was to smack things down. And for that end, senators were, until 1913 and the ratification of the 17th Amendment, appointed by state legislatures. They were not elected. And state legislatures, for the longest time, would be elected, but they would also be made up of moneyed men. And also, it's no accident that every state, regardless of population, has 2 senators. So the thing where Wyoming, with I don't know how many people live in Wyoming, maybe 500? No, I'm kidding. But there's not a lot of people in Wyoming. They have 2 senators. California, with the however many millions are living kind of California. I didn't look this up before because apparently I didn't really prepare, but whatever. California, much bigger than Wyoming, also 2 senators. So a single person in Wyoming has a lot more say in the Senate than a single person in California has. So that makes the Senate blatantly undemocratic. Anyway, So where am I going here? Is the United States a democracy, or is it a republic? So to quote Dora the Explorer, ¿Por qué no los dos? The U.S. is a democratic republic, but the system this country operates under, however, does retain a whole slew of aspects that are blatantly and by design undemocratic. Because the founders were scared shitless about the mob, and this fear historically had been fueled by a couple of popular uprisings that started as early as 1676 when Bacon's Rebellion rose up against Virginia elites, and as late as 1787 and Shays' Rebellion, where locals in western Massachusetts rose up in resistance to federal tax collectors. But the founders, and more importantly, the framers of the hallowed Constitution, actually, no, Shays' Rebellion was not federal tax collectors, that was Massachusetts tax collectors. Anyway, never mind, doesn't matter. The framers of the hallowed Constitution had their own best self-interests in mind when they created the foundations of the country. The people who wrote the Constitution essentially committed a coup in principle because they lacked the authority to create a new constitution. When they did so, they had come together in Philadelphia to improve the Articles of Confederation in 1789. And since they were all wealthy landowners, half of them owned other people in slavery. And these guys are who we look up to now, embedded. These guys who we look up to now, they embedded means to secure their own benefits into the foundational laws of the land that they had created. And, I guess we're supposed to respect that as if it was divinely ordained, because supposedly, this is a country that God created, or some nonsense like that. The framers' notes on the Constitution, by the way, were decreed to be embargoed until after their deaths, which seems like they really didn't have anything to hide there at all. As political commentator Jared Yates Sexton, he just tweeted it out fame, puts it in his book American Rule, the only prevailing ideology among the framers was a fear of the American common people, a belief in the superiority of the wealthy white elites, and a need for a government to prevent the people from carrying out further revolution after the American Revolution had succeeded in throwing off the British. There were not to be any excesses of democracy, as James Madison himself put it. The system would function in such a way that the majority of the country would never threaten the minority, and the minority here being rich, white, wealthy land and slave owners. The entire federal government is shot through with these safeguards against the mob, against the people. And so, yes, the United States is a democracy, insofar as that it's a kind of like subspecies of democracy. Albeit it is one that at many, many levels is rigged against democratic outcomes intentionally. Really makes your head spin until you fall off your soapbox. Tune in next week at some point, and also, subscribe. Spread the word. We really need subscribers here. And tune into This Is Hell at thisishell.com. Mondays to Wednesdays at 10 p.m. Chicago time for new, This Is Hell interviews, episodes with Chuck and me and the rest of the This Is Hell crew. Until next time,